So, imagine surviving like 8,000 miles of uncharted wilderness.
Right.
You've endured starvation in the bitter snows of the Rocky Mountains, navigated rivers that literally wanted to drown you, and, stood face to face with grizzly bears.
And you've had to negotiate with heavily armed indigenous nations.
Exactly. I mean, you are a seasoned military commander days away from completing the most consequential expedition in American history,
Yeah.
only to get shot in the backside by your own nearsighted fiddle player.
It sounds like a bad comedy, honestly. But that is exactly the kind of chaotic, entirely unpredictable reality that defined the return journey of the Corps of Discovery.
It really does.
I mean, the neat, triumphant historical narrative we're usually taught completely falls apart once you look at the actual logbooks from 1806.
Welcome back, everyone, to the fourth and final part of this deep dive series into the Lewis and Clark expedition.
It's good to be here for the grand finale.
You've been with us through the grueling departure from St. Louis, those freezing winter encampments, and the exhausting push all the way to the Pacific coast.
Yeah, we saw them plant their flag and claim their glory.
But okay, let's unpack this. Because getting to the Pacific was really only half the battle. Surviving the return trip and what happened after they got back is where the real story begins.
And it is a story that requires us to strip away a lot of mythology. Today, we are strictly following the chronological timeline of events, starting from the moment they packed up Fort Clatsop in March of 1806.
Right.
We are looking at the splintering of the Corps, the bizarre and violent crises that struck them, their triumphant return, and, well, the wildly divergent, often deeply tragic fates of the Corps members.
So put yourself in their shoes on March 23rd, 1806. They abandoned Fort Clatsop.
Yeah.
They are racing against time, pushing upstream along the Columbia River, and they quickly realize that dragging heavy dugout canoes overland just isn't going to work.
No, not at all.
So they start trading for pack horses to carry their gear. But almost immediately, they hit a massive, impenetrable wall of ice and rock.
The Bitterroot Mountains, which forces a brutal confrontation with the limits of human ambition.
Yeah.
They reach the territory of the Nez Perce Nation in mid-May. And from May 14th all the way to June 10th, 1806, they are entirely paralyzed.
Yeah.
They just have to wait.
I can't even imagine the psychological toll of that.
Oh, it had to be immense.
I mean, you've been gone for 2 years, you know exactly which direction home is, but the deep winter snowpack in the mountains is 15 feet deep and completely impassable. You are just stuck.
It was an agonizing test of patience for military men conditioned to constantly push forward.
Right.
But, the environment dictates the schedule on the frontier.
Right. Nature always wins.
Exactly. And the Nez Perce, who understood the seasonal rhythms of the Bitterroots perfectly, hosted them and essentially kept them alive while they waited for the thaw. It isn't until the end of June that they finally managed to navigate the treacherous, snowy passes and arrive back at Traveler's Rest, near present-day Missoula, Montana.
And this is where they make a tactical decision that, when I was reading through our sources, genuinely made me stop and reread the page.
It's a shocking move.
They are at Traveler's Rest. They are exhausted. They've barely survived the mountains. And on July 3rd, 1806, Lewis and Clark decide to split the party.
Yeah.
And not just in two. They shatter the group into 4 separate detachments.
It was a massive, highly calculated decentralization of command.
Who went where?
Well, Meriwether Lewis takes 9 enlisted men, the hunter George Drouillard and his dog Seaman, and 17 horses, and heads north to explore the Marias River.
Okay.
William Clark takes the bulk of the personnel, 23 people, including Sacagawea, her toddler Jean-Baptiste York, and a massive horse herd and heads south into the Yellowstone River Valley.
And the other 2?
Meanwhile, Sergeants John Ordway and Patrick Gass lead smaller details to manage canoes and cache supplies around the Great Falls.
But wait, if I'm out in the wilderness today and I drop my only GPS device in a river, that's a total disaster.
Absolutely.
Splitting up your forces in 1806, having your firepower, and completely eliminating your redundancies just to gather some extra map data, that seems like a glaring flaw in their plan.
I can see why you'd say that.
Why take such a monumental existential gamble when you are already stretched so thin?
This raises an important question about the thin margin of safety they were operating under. It was a monumental risk.
Sure.
But we have to look at the fundamental purpose of the expedition itself.
Right.
It's tempting to look at this through the lens of modern wilderness survival, where the goal is simply to get out alive. But they were operating under a direct mandate from President Thomas Jefferson.
This was a scientific, geopolitical, and imperial data-gathering mission.
Exactly. Touching the Pacific Ocean was great PR, But Jefferson needed the map. The geopolitical future of American expansion depended on exhaustive geographic data.
So they needed to know everything.
Right. What if there was a shorter, more navigable river passage they had missed on the way out? What if a different mountain pass offered a better trade route to the Pacific?
Oh, I see.
If they didn't map the Marias and the Yellowstone rivers now, a rival power like Britain might do it first. So they divide to conquer the map, accepting the terrifying physical risk that comes with it.
And that terrifying physical risk materializes almost instantly, literally on day one of the split.
It really does.
July 3, Lewis's detachment needs to cross the Clark Fork River. It's a fast-moving, 150-yard-wide rapid.
And they don't have dugout canoes.
Right, so they have to improvise. They construct makeshift rafts out of pine logs, binding them together with willow bark.
Which is an incredibly precarious piece of engineering.
Because of the bark.
Well, pine is highly buoyant, yes, but binding it with green willow bark while navigating a heavy, shifting, turbulent current is inviting disaster. The structural integrity just isn't there for a rough crossing.
And the river proves that point immediately. The rafts are swept downriver into a hazardous, flooded channel choked with submerged islands and overhanging willows.
It's chaos.
Lewis is standing on one of these makeshift rafts, and a heavy branch sweeps him completely off his feet and into the rapids.
And we have to highlight a crucial, often overlooked detail here.
What's that?
Meriwether Lewis, the great frontier explorer, could barely swim.
Oh, wow. He's thrashing in the icy water, fighting the current, and he miraculously manages to drag himself to shore.
Thank goodness.
But he had something tucked into his pocket that was far more valuable than his own comfort. He was carrying his fob, the expedition's primary chronometer.
Which is the single most vital piece of scientific equipment they possessed.
Let's actually pause on that because I think it's easy to gloss over the word chronometer. Why was a fancy pocket watch so critical to mapping the continent?
Because of how you determine longitude.
Okay, explain that.
Latitude, how far north or south you are, is relatively easy to calculate by measuring the angle of the sun or the North Star. But longitude, how far east or west you are, requires knowing the exact time difference between your current location and a fixed reference point, usually Greenwich Mean Time.
Right, time zones.
Exactly. For every hour of difference between local solar noon and Greenwich time, you are 15 degrees of longitude away. To do that math, you need a clock that keeps absolute perfect time, regardless of temperature changes or the motion of a ship. That's a chronometer.
And Lewis's chronometer is now completely soaked in river water.
Yeah, the delicate internal gears are flooded. It's ruined.
Because of one submerged branch on day one of their grand split, his ability to make precise astronomical calculations is severely compromised.
It's a huge blow.
The entire scientific justification for risking his detachment's lives is instantly cast into shadow.
It perfectly illustrates the razor-thin margins they were operating on. They split up to gather scientific data, and lacking the manpower to build proper transport, the very tool needed to record that data is destroyed.
So we move into mid-July 1806, and we start tracking these parallel journeys. And the contrast between what Lewis is experiencing in the north and what Clark is dealing with in the south is just staggering.
It really is.
Lewis's detachment is enduring an absolute nightmare.
Lewis is pushing up the Marias River, attempting to prove that it extends the Louisiana Purchase territory far north, past the 49th parallel, deep into what the British considered Canada.
He is trying to push the boundary of the United States.
Exactly. But he's doing this in sovereign Blackfeet country with an incredibly undermanned crew.
How many guys did he have?
He originally wanted to take 6 men, but earlier horse thefts forced him to cut his party down to just 4. Himself, George Drouillard, and the brothers Joseph and Reuben Field. 4 guys.
A dangerously small footprint in a territory controlled by a fiercely protective Confederacy that did not welcome trespassers.
Just to say the least.
And the environment itself seems hostile. By July 22, the weather turns brutally cold and wet. It's constantly cloudy. And because of the cloud cover, Lewis can't even attempt to use his damaged equipment to take celestial readings.
He's flying blind.
He finally realizes the river doesn't cross the 49th parallel. It doesn't go where he needs it to go. They are out of food. It is a total operational failure.
Yeah.
He literally writes in his journal that he is naming their encampment Camp Disappointment before ordering his men to turn back toward the Missouri River.
Naming it Camp Disappointment really captures the profound psychological exhaustion of the return journey. The grand imperial discoveries they had banked on are evaporating in the cold rain.
Meanwhile, Clark's Southern Track is dealing with its own brand of chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
They've traveled overland to the Yellowstone River, managing a herd of 50 horses, and the frontier is taking a severe physical toll.
Yes, the landscape is entirely unforgiving. Private George Gibson falls from his horse onto a burned snag, a sharp piece of dead wood, and it drives nearly 2 inches deep into his thigh.
We have to remember what that means in 1806. That is not just a painful cut.
No, it's potentially lethal.
A 2-inch deep puncture wound from a dirty piece of wood in the wilderness is a horrifying, highly infectious injury. And then Toussaint Charbonneau, Sacagawea's husband, is badly bruised when his horse steps in a badger hole and throws him violently to the ground.
They desperately need to transition from horseback to water transport to rest these men, but they struggle for days to find cottonwood trees large enough to carve into dugout canoes.
They finally find suitable timber on July 24th. They carve out 2 small canoes, lash them together side by side to create a stable catamaran so they don't tip over, and they set off down the Yellowstone. And as they float down this river, the descriptions in the source material are just breathtaking, the sheer scale of the wildlife.
The biomass of the Great Plains before mass Euro-American settlement is almost inconceivable to a modern listener. We are talking about ecosystems functioning at maximum capacity.
Clark writes about navigating around migrating herds of bison that are crossing the river. But we aren't talking about a few dozen animals. He describes solid columns of bison a 1/4 mile wide, plunging into the water, creating a biological dam that literally blocks the river.
A 1/4 mile wide column of animals. Just let that sink in.
The expedition has to pull their canoes to the bank and wait, sometimes for over an hour, just watching thousands upon thousands of these massive animals swim past before the river clears enough to proceed.
It's a vivid, thundering reminder of the ancient, thriving world they were moving through, an environment operating entirely on its own sovereign rhythms, completely indifferent to the American explorers.
And right in the middle of this vast, indifferent landscape, Clark decides to leave a very deliberate mark.
He does?
On July 25, 1806, Clark's group comes across a massive sandstone outcrop. It rises nearly 200 feet above the southern bank of the Yellowstone River. Clark pulls the canoes over and climbs to the top.
And what does he find there?
Well, the rock is already covered in intricate native petroglyphs and pictographs. It is clearly a sacred or significant site for the indigenous nations who have lived there for centuries.
Right.
Clark looks out at the panoramic view of the plains, and he decides to name the rock Pompey's Tower.
Naming it after Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, Sacagawea's toddler, who Clark had nicknamed Pomp. Today, we know the landmark is Pompey's Pillar.
But Clark doesn't just record the name in his journal. Before he climbs down, he takes his knife and he carves his own name and the date deep into the sandstone, right over the ancient petroglyphs.
Over the petroglyphs?
Yeah. W.E.M. Clark, July 25, 1806.
And from an archaeological standpoint, that inscription holds a profound significance.
How so?
Out of the 8,000 miles they traveled, out of the years spent in the wilderness, that single carved signature on Pompey's Pillar is the only surviving physical evidence of the expedition's passage left on the western landscape today. The only physical footprint we can still touch.
It's a haunting detail. But while Clark is floating down the river, carving his name into sandstone, his overland attachment is fighting a losing battle against the masters of the plains.
Yeah, we have to talk about Sergeant Nathaniel Pryor.
Pryor was given a virtually impossible assignment. When Clark took the water route, Pryor was ordered to drive the remaining massive horse herd overland all the way to the Mandan villages.
And then carry letters to British posts in Canada to try and recruit Sioux chiefs for diplomatic talks.
But Pryor's detail is immediately targeted by Crow raiders, and our sources emphasize that the Crow were highly skilled, stealthy tacticians.
Absolutely masterful.
On the night of July 20, they infiltrate Pryor's camp and silently drive off half of the horse herd without waking a single guard.
Not one guard woke up.
Pryor spends a day trying to track them, fails, and sets up camp again. And then, 2 nights later, the raiders return and execute the exact same maneuver, vanishing into the night with the remaining 24 horses.
It is a master class in tactical dominance. The Crow didn't want to kill the Americans, they just wanted the wealth the horses represented, and they took it with absolute precision.
So Pryor and his 3 men, Shannon, Windsor, and Hall, wake up completely stranded on the open plains. 0 horses.
Just stuck.
All their heavy supplies are sitting on the ground. They attempt to track the thieves on foot for about 10 miles, realize the futility of chasing mounted warriors on foot, and turn back to the Yellowstone River near Pompey's Pillar.
And this is where we see the absolute necessity of frontier adaptability.
Yeah, they're stranded, and there are no large cottonwood trees around to make dugout canoes.
Which forces them to rely on indigenous technology. They construct what are known as bull boats.
Right. I was fascinated by this. How exactly does a fresh bison hide turn into a functional boat in 2 days?
It's a brilliant piece of engineering based on the physical properties of animal hide. They cut down flexible willow branches and weave them together to form a large, bowl-shaped frame.
Like a giant basket.
Exactly. Then they hunt a bison, skin it, and stretch the heavy, wet rawhide over the willow frame, flesh side in.
Okay.
As the rawhide dries in the sun, it dramatically shrinks and tightens around the frame, creating a rigid, waterproof, incredibly buoyant vessel. Because it's bowl-shaped, it displaces a large amount of water relative to its weight, meaning it can carry hundreds of pounds of men and gear while only drafting a few inches of water.
That is incredible. They build 2 of these bull boats, lash them together, and actually manage to navigate the Yellowstone, safely reuniting with Clark's fleet on August 8th.
And the only casualty was...
Right. The only casualty of Pryor's entire disastrous land mission was getting a painful wolf bite on his hand while he was sleeping.
It's a testament to their resourcefulness, yes.
Yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it underscores a vital reality of the expedition.
What's that?
The Americans were moving through territories controlled by sovereign indigenous nations who were infinitely more skilled at navigating, utilizing, and dominating that specific landscape.
Right.
The loss of those horses wasn't bad luck. It was a clear demonstration of sovereign power by the Crow Nation.
And that very concept, the violent collision of overlapping sovereign claims, brings us to the most intense and tragic crisis of the entire 2.5-year journey.
The events of July 26 and 27, 1806.
We are jumping back north to Meriwether Lewis's detachment in Montana near Two Medicine Creek.
This incident is the only fatal encounter of the expedition. And it is crucial to understand that this wasn't just random frontier lawlessness. This was an inevitable clash driven by national security and economic competition.
Let's set the board. Lewis, George Drouillard, and the Field brothers are riding south, trying to escape the freezing rain of Camp Disappointment.
Okay.
They are crossing a vast, open expanse of the plains. Suddenly, they spot a group of 8 young Piikani men members of the powerful Blackfeet Confederacy herding a large group of horses.
Right.
Lewis scans the terrain. There is no timber, no cover. He is completely exposed. He calculates that if he tries to run or hide, they will look like prey, which will invite an immediate ambush.
In military terms, he felt compelled to engage to maintain a posture of strength. Retreating would signal weakness to a culturally dominant warrior society.
So they ride directly toward them. They use Drouillard, who is an expert in Plains Indian Sign Language, to communicate.
Both sides are incredibly cautious.
But they eventually agree to camp together down in a sheltered river bottom for the night. They build a fire. And this is where Lewis, sitting around that campfire, makes what can only be described as a catastrophic geopolitical blunder.
He really does.
He decides to give a speech about American dominance.
Through sign language, he proudly announces to these young Piikani warriors that the United States government has purchased this entire territory.
Just casually dropping that in.
Right. He tells them that the Americans have already established peace treaties with the Shoshone and the Nez Perce nations.
Okay.
And most critically, he details the U.S. plan to build trading posts that will supply all the regional tribes with modern firearms and manufactured goods.
When I read that, it felt like the equivalent of modern nuclear non-proliferation. Lewis basically walked into a superpower's territory and announced he was handing out warheads to their mortal enemies.
That is a highly accurate analogy. You have to look at it from the perspective of the Blackfeet Confederacy.
Right. How did they see this?
They controlled the flow of trade goods and firearms between the British merchants up in Canada and the tribal nations of the Northern Plains. They maintained their regional hegemony, their safety, their dominance, their way of life by intentionally and violently keeping firearms out of the hands of their rivals.
Specifically the Shoshone.
Exactly.
So Lewis essentially just sat down at their campfire, drank their water, and said, "Hey, we're taking over your land, and we are going to heavily arm the very people you've spent generations keeping unarmed."
Precisely. Lewis was declaring a direct existential national security threat to the Blackfeet. He was telling them he was going to systematically dismantle the balance of power that kept their people safe.
Wow.
Add to that the fact that these 4 Americans were trespassing in sovereign Blackfeet territory without any diplomatic clearance, and they were carrying highly accurate military-grade rifles.
So they were targets.
To the young Pekuni men, these Americans weren't just rude guests. They were a profound threat, carrying a massive technological prize.
The tension around that fire must have been suffocating. They eventually go to sleep. Dawn breaks on July 27. Private Joseph Field is on guard duty, but he lets his exhaustion get the better of him.
A fatal mistake.
He sets his rifle down. He dozes off. The young Pekuni men see their opening, and they attempt a coup. They quietly seize the expedition's rifles and start driving off the horses, including Lewis's personal mount.
And the camp instantly erupts into physical violence.
Right.
George Drouillard wakes up, realizes what's happening, and starts shouting, alerting the rest of the party.
Reuben Field wakes up, sees a Pekuni man running off with his brother's rifle, and he chases him down. There is a desperate close-quarter struggle over the weapon.
Yeah.
Reuben Field draws his hunting knife and stabs the young Pekuni man directly through the heart. The oral histories of the tribe identify this man as Sidehill Calf. He is killed instantly.
Meanwhile, Lewis is jolted awake by the shouting. He grabs his horse pistol and chases two other young men who are trying to drive off his horse herd.
Lewis is running across the plains, yelling at them to let the horses go. They refuse and raise an old British musket. Lewis raises his pistol and shoots one of them in the abdomen.
A terrible scene.
The wounded youth falls to his knees, but he manages to raise his own weapon and return fire. The sources say the bullet whistled right past Lewis's bare head.
Just missed him.
The wounded young man then crawls away into a dry draw, suffering from what was almost certainly a fatal wound.
Two Pekuni men dead or dying. The sudden silence that must have fallen over that camp after the gunfire stopped is hard to fathom.
In the immediate adrenaline-fueled aftermath, Lewis actually shows a rare moment of tactical restraint. The Field brothers are enraged. They want to shoot the fleeing survivors. Drouillard wants to hunt them down.
And Lewis stops them.
Lewis orders them to stand down immediately. He knows any more violence will just guarantee a massive retaliation that will wipe them out. But then, as they are packing up to flee, Lewis does something that just drips with arrogance.
It is a stunning display of imperial hubris.
Yes. Lewis reclaims his horses. He gathers up the shields, bows, and arrows that the Blackfeet left behind in the chaos, and he throws them into the campfire, burning them.
Right.
And then he walks over to the dead body of Sidehill Calf. He takes out a silver Thomas Jefferson peace medal, the very medals they used to signify friendship and diplomacy, and he hangs it around the corpse's neck. He later wrote in his journal that he did this so that they might be informed who we were.
What's fascinating here is how this single calculated political statement reverberated through history.
Because it caused a lot of problems later, right?
Exactly. Lewis wanted to send a message that the United States would not tolerate attacks.
Yeah.
But leaving a literal calling card on a dead body catalyzed decades of deep-seated hostility.
Oh, wow.
This event fundamentally shaped the geopolitics of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. The Blackfeet Nation would remember this violence, and they would view American fur trappers as hostile invaders, leading to years of bloodshed.
A calling card on a corpse? It's a chilling image. But Lewis knows he can't stick around to admire his handiwork. He knows the surviving Pekuni men are riding hard to alert their main camp, which likely has hundreds of warriors.
So they have to run.
Lewis and his 3 men mount up and flee. It is a desperate, terrifying sprint for survival. They ride over 100 miles south in less than 24 hours.
That's exhausting just to think about.
They ride through the night, pushing their horses to absolute breaking point, terrified that every shadow is a Blackfeet war party, until they finally reach the Missouri River, miraculously intercept Sergeant Ordway's canoe party, and escape downstream.
They narrowly avoided a total wipeout. But the danger wasn't over for Meriwether Lewis. The irony of this entire expedition is that after surviving the Bitterroot Snows, starvation, and a shootout with the Blackfeet, his most severe, debilitating injury comes from his own side.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we're moving to August 11th, 1806.
The hunting trip.
Yes. Lewis's combined force is moving rapidly down the Missouri River. They are in northwestern North Dakota, near what are now called the Crow Hills. They spot a herd of elk grazing in a dense willow thicket on the riverbank. They are low on provisions. Lewis needs fresh meat, so he goes ashore to hunt.
Right.
And he takes Private Pierre Cruzat with him.
Now, Cruzat is a highly respected half-French, half-Omaha boatman. He's also the expedition's premier fiddler. His music literally kept morale from collapsing over the past 2 years.
But there's a catch.
Crucially, Cruzat is severely visually impaired. He is completely blind in one eye and extremely nearsighted in the other.
Which makes him the last person you want as your hunting partner in a dense, tangled thicket. Especially when you consider what they were wearing.
Exactly.
It's been over 2 years since they left civilization. Their U.S. Army uniforms have completely rotted away. Both Lewis and Cruzat are dressed head to toe in weathered buckskins and elk skins. In the dappled light of the willows, they literally look like the elk they are hunting.
It is a profound failure of situational awareness.
Yeah. Lewis is deep in the thicket. He raises his rifle, preparing to fire at an elk. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a .54 caliber rifle ball strikes him from behind.
Oh, man.
It tears through his left thigh about an inch below the hip joint and exits through his right buttock, leaving a massive 3-inch gash. The kinetic force of the impact actually spins him around. Lewis screams out, "Damn you, you have shot me."
He assumes, naturally, that Cruzat made a terrible mistake, but he gets no response.
Complete silence from the thicket. So Lewis's mind instantly jumps to the worst-case scenario. He thinks they were being ambushed by a hostile war party and that Cruzat has just been killed silently.
Right, he thinks the Blackfeet have caught up to him.
Bleeding heavily, operating on pure adrenaline, Lewis manages to limp all the way back to the canoes. He orders the men to arm themselves immediately and sends a rescue party back into the willows to find Cruzat.
And they find Cruzat, who is highly alarmed by the commotion but completely unharmed. There is no evidence of an ambush, no native warriors anywhere.
Cruzat vehemently denies shooting the captain. He swears he shot at what he thought was an elk moving through the brush. But the forensic proof is literally in the pants.
Literally.
They recover the spent bullet from Lewis's leather breeches. It's a .54 caliber military ball. It perfectly matches the ammunition used in Cruzat's U.S. Army-issued rifle. It was friendly fire.
To his credit as a commander, Lewis recognized it was a genuine accident born of poor visibility and the chaos of the thicket. He didn't formally punish Cruzat, but the medical reality of the wound was incredibly severe.
We have to talk about frontier medicine here because Sergeant Patrick Gass is tasked with treating a through-and-through gunshot wound to the upper thigh and buttocks in the middle of a riverbank.
Which sounds like a nightmare.
He packs the entry and exit wounds with lint to stop the bleeding, and he dresses them with Peruvian bark.
Peruvian bark is a fascinating historical detail. It contains quinine.
Isn't that for malaria?
Today, we know quinine primarily as an antimalarial drug, yes. But in 1806, it was a standard-issue botanical medicine used as a general antiseptic and a powerful fever reducer. When applied topically or ingested, it helped regulate the body's inflammatory response.
I had no idea.
They didn't understand germ theory, but the quinine in the bark was surprisingly effective at preventing massive systemic infection. Though the physical pain of having a packed wound in a damp canoe must have been excruciating.
Beyond the pain, it was deeply humiliating. Lewis, the great military commander who survived everything the continent could throw at him, gets shot in the rear by his own nearsighted fiddler.
Yeah.
For the final leg of the journey, Lewis is completely incapacitated. He can't walk. He can't stand. He spends the rest of the trip lying face down on a wooden board in the bottom of a pirogue, unable to lead, while Clark has to manage the daily operations of the fleet.
It's a very undignified final leg for the co-captain. But the momentum of the expedition was undeniable at this point. The very next day, August 12, 1806, the divided forces officially reunite on the Missouri River at Reunion Bay in North Dakota. The Corps of Discovery is whole again.
They stop briefly at the Mandan villages, and this is where the Corps team starts to permanently break apart. They officially discharge Toussaint Charbonneau. Sacagawea and young Jean-Baptiste stay with him in the west.
Right.
Private John Coulter asks for an early release so he can turn right back around and go back into the Rocky Mountains with some fur trappers they met on the river. But the rest of the crew pushes on toward home.
And as they sweep past the settlement of St. Charles on September 21, the reaction of the public is total astonishment.
Because they thought they were dead.
The American public and the federal government had essentially written them off. They had been gone so long with no communication that they were presumed dead, lost to the wilderness.
Then, at noon on Tuesday, September 23rd, 1806, exactly 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days after they departed, the 5 dugout canoes and the white pirogue pull into the St. Louis riverfront. I love the description in the sources here.
It's such a striking image.
The men are dressed entirely in patched animal skins. They have massive long hair and unkempt beards. They look like a ragged crew of Robinson Crusoes stepping off the boats.
The entire population of St. Louis, about 1,500 citizens, gathers on the bluffs. They are cheering wildly, firing guns into the air. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The impossible had been achieved.
The captains store their baggage at Major William Christie's Tavern, and on September 25, the citizens host a grand celebratory dinner and ball. They raise 18 formal toasts.
18, that's a lot of drinking.
They honor President Jefferson as the friend of science, the polar star of discovery. They toast the heads of departments as the pillars that support the world's best hope. And they end the night with a roaring tribute to Lewis and Clark, declaring that their perilous services endear them to every American heart.
It is the absolute pinnacle of their public glory, the culmination of their myth. But as the hangovers from those 18 toasts faded, the stark, deeply inequitable reality of their return to American society began to set in.
York wasn't the only one who found that surviving the wilderness was actually easier than surviving civilization. But his story is perhaps the most infuriating, because the compensation handed out by the government after this heroic journey was anything but equal.
The United States Congress passed an act on March 3, 1807, to authorize compensation for the Corps, and the disparity is glaring.
Meriwether Lewis and William Clark each received double pay for their service. Plus, they each receive a land grant of 1,600 acres of public land.
Which is huge.
That is over 2.5 square miles of territory. At the minimum government land value of the time, that was worth over $2,600. In 1807, that is an absolute fortune.
And what about the others?
The enlisted men, the sergeants and privates, also received double pay, and they each get 320 acres.
A substantial reward that allowed many of the enlisted men to sell their land warrants to speculators and start businesses or fund further trapping expeditions. It was life-changing wealth for working-class soldiers.
But then we look at York. York was William Clark's enslaved personal servant. He was an indispensable member of the expedition. For 8,000 miles, he did exactly what the enlisted men did.
Right.
He carried firearms, he hunted for game, he constructed shelters, he cared for the sick, he stood watch against grizzly bears.
Furthermore, he played a crucial diplomatic role that the white members could not. Many native nations, like the Mandan and the Arikara, had never seen an African-American man before.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they believed his skin possessed great spiritual power. They named him Big Medicine. His very presence was often treated as a sign of peaceful intent by the tribes they encountered. He fascinated them, which facilitated trade and diplomacy.
And most importantly, during the brutal winter when they reached the Pacific Ocean, they had to decide where to build Fort Clatsop. They were deciding on their winter survival strategy. They held a democratic vote.
And York voted.
And York's vote was counted equally alongside the captains and the enlisted men. The sources note this is the first recorded instance of a black man voting in U.S. history.
He experienced an unprecedented level of autonomy, responsibility, and functional equality during those 2.5 years in the wilderness. But when the canoes landed in St. Louis, that equality vanished instantly.
York received 0 double pay. He received 0 acres of land, he was legally considered property, and he returned directly to chattel slavery under William Clark.
The sources show that York actually petitioned Clark for his freedom as compensation for his grueling service. He argued he had earned it.
Which he absolutely had.
Or at the very least, he asked for permission to remain in Louisville, Kentucky, where his wife was enslaved by another master, so he could be near his family.
And Clark's response shatters the benevolent, heroic image that history often paints of him. Clark flatly refused. He viewed York's desire to be free, or even just to be near his wife, as insolent and presumptuous.
In the 1980s, historians discovered a cache of post-expedition letters written by William Clark. And they are brutal to read.
What do they say?
They show a deeply harsh, punitive attitude toward a man who had literally watched his back across a continent. Clark complains about York being sulky. He admits to beating him. He actually had York jailed in a St. Louis calaboose for a time to punish him.
Clark eventually hired York out to a severe master in Louisville, specifically to break his spirit. Clark wrote a letter to his brother Jonathan saying, "If any attempt is made by York to run off, I wish him sent to New Orleans and sold, or hired out to some severe master until he thinks better of such conduct."
It is a chilling display of the cruel realities of the institution of slavery, overriding any bond forged in the wilderness. The shared trauma of the expedition meant nothing against the legal and economic structure of slavery.
We have to maintain an impartial view of the historical records here because York's ultimate fate is clouded by 2 highly contradictory accounts.
Right.
He was eventually granted his freedom around 1816, 10 years after they returned. But what happened next?
Account number 1 comes directly from William Clark in a conversation he had with the author Washington Irving in 1832.
Okay.
Clark claimed that York's freedom was a complete failure. According to Clark, he He bought York a wagon and 6 horses to start a freight hauling business between Kentucky and Tennessee.
But Clark says York was a terrible businessman, neglected his horses, and lost everything. Clark even claimed that York lamented being free, saying, "Damn this freedom, I have never had a happy day since I got it," and that York was trying to walk back to St. Louis to return to slavery when he caught cholera in Tennessee and died.
Now, modern historians view this specific account with immense skepticism. It relies entirely on the deeply racist, paternalistic tropes of the 19th century. The narrative that enslaved people were incapable of surviving as free citizens and secretly desired to return to bondage. It served Clark's conscience to believe York failed without him.
But then there is account number 2, which is radically different. This comes from an 1839 publication by a mountain man and fur trapper named Zenas Leonard.
Leonard wrote that while he was trapping in the Bihorn River country of Wyoming in the autumn of 1832, he encountered an old black man living among a band of Crow Indians.
This man told Leonard that he had first traveled west with Lewis and Clark, returned to Missouri, but then eventually escaped back to the mountains with a fur trader.
And he stayed there.
Leonard reported that this man had lived among the Crow for over a decade, spoke their language fluently, had risen to the rank of an honored chief, and was living comfortably with 4 wives.
We cannot definitively prove either version, but the narrative of York returning to the Rocky Mountains, to a place where his skills were respected and his autonomy was absolute, remains a powerful counter-narrative to Clark's tragic, self-serving account.
It really highlights how the history of this expedition is not just one story, but dozens of individual stories that splintered in wildly different directions once the unifying mission was over.
Yeah.
Meriwether Lewis returned as a national hero, but he also found that the wilderness was far easier to navigate than the society he came home to.
The contrast between Lewis the explorer and Lewis the politician is stark. The wilderness brought out his brilliance, his resilience, his decisive leadership. But the return to civilization marked the beginning of a rapid, fatal psychological collapse.
In March 1807, President Jefferson rewards his protege by appointing Lewis as the governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory. He's headquartered in St. Louis.
Right.
On paper, it sounds like a great honor, the perfect capstone to his career. In reality, it was a disaster.
Lewis was a highly disciplined military commander. He was used to giving orders in the field and having them obeyed instantly by subordinates. He was completely unsuited for the complex, compromising, backstabbing world of territorial politics, where power is negotiated, not commanded.
He immediately clashes with the territorial secretary, a man named Frederick Bates. Bates runs a systematic, almost cruel campaign to undermine Lewis's authority at every turn.
Bates was relentless.
He accuses the new governor of financial incompetence and administrative neglect behind his back in letters to Washington. And honestly, Lewis's personal life is falling apart at the exact same time.
He is plagued by escalating debts from failed land speculations. He attempts to court several women, but fails to secure a wife, which was socially expected of a man of his political stature.
And looming over all of this is the immense public pressure from Jefferson to edit and publish the expedition journals.
Which he just cannot bring himself to do. The task paralyzes him. We know from Jefferson's own writings that Lewis suffered from severe clinical depression. Jefferson noted it was an inherited family trait.
Right.
And to cope with the stress of Bates, the crushing debt, and the depression, Lewis increasingly turns to heavy alcohol consumption and opium to self-medicate.
The breaking point comes in 1809. The new presidential administration under James Madison refuses to honor several official government vouchers that Lewis had drawn to fund territorial operations.
He essentially bounces checks.
This leaves Lewis personally liable for thousands of dollars. He is pushed to the absolute brink of financial ruin and public disgrace.
So in September 1809, a desperate Meriwether Lewis packs his bags and sets out from St. Louis for Washington, D.C. He intends to defend his financial accounts in person to the administration and salvage his reputation. He travels via the Natchez Trace.
And what was the Natchez Trace like back then?
The Natchez Trace was a notorious 400-mile wilderness trail stretching from Mississippi to Tennessee. It was heavily forested, isolated, and infested with bandits.
On the evening of October 10, 1809, Lewis arrives at a small, rustic log cabin inn known as Grinder's Stand. The innkeeper's wife, Priscilla Grinder, is the primary witness to what happens next.
Right.
And her accounts state that she was immediately struck by Lewis's erratic, feverish behavior.
She observed him pacing wildly, talking to himself in agitated tones, and at one point during dinner, launching into a violent verbal tirade at thin air. His psychological state was clearly fractured.
Because of his unsettling actions, Priscilla Grinder and her children actually decide to sleep in an adjacent cabin, locking the door. They leave Lewis alone in the main room of the stand with his servants in the barn. The night passes. And then, in the early morning hours of October 11, Priscilla Grinder is awakened by the sound of 2 pistol shots.
Through the cracks in the cabin wall, she reports seeing a bleeding Meriwether Lewis crawl out of the main room into the yard. He is begging for water and pleading with her to heal his wounds.
But she is terrified. She ignores his cries. She locks her door and doesn't send her servants to investigate until dawn breaks.
When they finally enter the main room, they find Lewis lying on his bed. He is still alive, but mortally wounded. The forensic details of his injuries are horrific.
Yeah, he sustained 2 gunshot wounds. One bullet had grazed his forehead, blowing away a portion of his skull but failing to penetrate the brain. The second bullet had entered his abdomen and passed completely through his torso.
And as if that wasn't enough, in his agony, the sources report he had taken his razors and slashed his own wrists and neck in a desperate attempt to hasten the end.
Lou Fest dies just after sunrise on October 11th, 1809. He was only 35 years old, and the heartbreaking detail here is that he bled to death lying on a buffalo skin robe that he had carried with him all the way from the transcontinental journey.
The man who survived grisly attacks, starvation, and the Blackfeet dies alone on a dirty floor in Tennessee. Now, we must impartially present the debate surrounding his death because the circumstances remain highly controversial to this day.
The historical consensus shared by his contemporaries like Thomas Jefferson and William Clark and championed by modern historians is that Lewis died by suicide.
Right.
The weight of his financial ruin, severe depression, untreated PTSD from the expedition, and substance abuse simply became too much to bear, and his mind snapped at Grinder's stand.
Yes, and proponents of the murder theory raise valid questions to counter that. They point out that Priscilla Grinder's accounts were highly inconsistent. Over 30 years, her story changed significantly, eventually including claims about 3 mysterious men who had allegedly followed Lewis and challenged him to a duel.
Some theorists argue it was a politically motivated assassination linked to the corrupt General James Wilkinson, who wanted Lewis silenced.
Or simple robbery.
Others suggest he was simply murdered by bandits on the trace, or even by the innkeeper himself, Robert Grinder, who was rumored to have suddenly acquired an unexplained sum of gold shortly after Lewis died.
There's also an alternative medical theory that posits Lewis did not intend to commit suicide at all.
Which is what?
This theory suggests he was suffering from acute delirium caused by advanced neurosyphilis or malaria. The fever-induced mania could have caused horrific hallucinations, leading to the self-inflicted wounds during a state of medical psychosis.
Lewis's descendants have repeatedly requested that the National Park Service exhume his remains from the National Monument in Tennessee to conduct modern forensic analysis. They want to know the truth.
But the Park Service has repeatedly denied those requests, citing the disturbance of a national monument. So the true cause of his death remains officially unsolved.
Amidst all this human tragedy, there is a small, deeply emotional detail regarding Seaman, Lewis's dog, that we have to mention.
Yes, the 150-pound Newfoundland. Seaman survived the entire trip. He survived grizzly bears. He survived a severed artery from a beaver bite in the Rockies. He returned to St. Louis with Lewis. But what happened to him after Lewis died?
According to an 1814 entry in Timothy Alden's historical collection of epitaphs, Seaman's collar was preserved in a museum in Alexandria, Virginia. The inscription on it read, "The greatest traveler of my species, my name is Seaman, the dog of Captain Meriwether Lewis, whom I accompanied to the Pacific Ocean through the interior of the continent of North America."
But Alden's records also state that after Lewis was buried at Grinder's stand, Seaman refused to leave his master's side. The dog accompanied the body to the grave, refused all food offered to him by grieving friends, and literally died of grief lying upon Lewis's burial mound.
It's an incredibly poignant end to one of the expedition's most loyal members.
It speaks to the intense bonds forged during those 2 years in the wilderness, bonds that often couldn't survive the brutal realities of the return to civilization.
Which brings us to the final aspect of our deep dive. Because while the individuals met tragic ends, the ripples of their journey completely reshaped the continent. Let's start with a lighter, incredibly fascinating fate. Little Pomp, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau.
His life story is almost unbelievable. He crosses the continent as an infant, strapped to Sacagawea's back. After the expedition, William Clark actually takes legal guardianship of him in 1809.
Really?
Yes. Clark pays for his room, board, and a rigorous classical education at the St. Louis Academy. The boy becomes fluent in French, English, German, and Spanish.
And then, in 1823, at the age of 18, he meets Duke Paul Wilhelm of Württemberg, a German aristocrat touring the American frontier.
The Duke is so impressed with this brilliant young man that he invites Jean-Baptiste to Europe. The kid who was born in a Mandan Earth Lodge spends 6 years living at a royal court in Stuttgart, Germany.
He acquires the tastes and education of a European gentleman, but the American West pulls him back. He returns in 1829 and completely reinvents himself as one of the most respected mountain men of the fur trade era. He traps beaver alongside legends like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson.
He later serves as a military scout during the Mexican-American War. Then the gold rush hits and he goes to California, where he actually serves as a mayor and alcalde of Mission San Luis Rey.
He lives a massive, sweeping life until 1866. At age 61, he heads for the new gold fields in Montana, trying to return to the scenes of his infancy, but he falls into the freezing Owyhee River in Oregon, catches pneumonia, and dies. His grave is still there in Oregon today.
His life bridges the gap between the era of exploration and the era of settlement. But the tool that truly catalyzed that transition, the object that changed everything, was William Clark's map.
Clark finally published his masterly hand-drawn map in 1814. If we connect this to the bigger picture, why was this specific map so revolutionary?
Because it replaced centuries of myth and guesswork with hard, empirical data. Before this map, people believed the West was a symmetrical mirror of the East, easily navigable by a single river. Clark's map provided the first accurate representation of the interior of Western North America.
It showed what was really there.
It detailed the complex, tangled network of rivers, the impassable mountain passes, and the specific tribal territories. Geopolitically, this map was the anchor. It gave the United States the tangible evidence it needed to lay formal claim to the Oregon Country, providing the leverage required against the British in the Pacific Northwest.
And economically, it was a gold mine for merchants. Within months of the expedition returning in 1806, a St. Louis merchant named Manuel Lisa realizes what they found.
He moves fast.
He takes the geographic intel from expedition members like John Coulter and George Drouillard, and in 1807, he organizes the St. Louis, Missouri Fur Company.
He builds Fort Raymond at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Bighorn Rivers, right where Clark had just traveled. This kicks off the entire mountain man era, drawing hundreds of American trappers into the West to harvest beaver pelts. John Jacob Astor follows soon after, pushing a massive global trade network all the way to the Columbia River.
So what does this all mean for the native tribes who hosted them? We talked about the Nez Perce saving them from starvation, the Mandan hosting them for a freezing winter, the Shoshone selling them the horses they needed to survive the mountains.
It's the great tragic irony of the expedition. The captains travel as emissaries of peace. They brought peace medals. They even carried live kindpox vaccine to inoculate the tribes against smallpox, though the vaccine died during the trip.
Right.
But by mapping the region so perfectly, they inadvertently opened the floodgates of Euro-American settlement.
The influx of white traders brought devastating epidemics of Old World diseases. Outbreaks of smallpox wiped out entire populations of Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa. Their ancient, thriving agricultural villages, the very villages that kept the core alive, were eventually left abandoned.
And diplomatically, the United States' official policy rapidly shifted. Jefferson's initial rhetoric of mutual respect and trade alliances was replaced by a systematic, decades-long campaign of displacement, treaty violations, and forced removal.
Wow.
The very routes that Lewis and Clark mapped to document the sovereign domains of these indigenous nations became the exact corridors of imperial conquest.
It permanently altered the human and ecological landscape of the continent.
The map brought clarity to the east, but it brought devastation to the west.
And that brings us to the end of our chronological timeline. We have tracked this journey from the grueling departure from Fort Clatsop, through the perilous splintering of the forces at Traveler's Rest, the violence at Two Medicine, the bizarre hunting accident, all the way to the cheering crowds in St. Louis and the tragic, complex lives that followed.
It's been quite the ride.
I want to thank you for sticking with us through all 4 parts of this series, traveling 8,000 miles and navigating the turbulent years that followed the core of discovery.
It is a story that defies simple categorization. It is heroic and tragic, scientifically brilliant and diplomatically devastating.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Think back to William Clark standing on top of Pompey's Pillar on July 25, 1806.
Yeah.
He is standing on a sandstone rock that had been covered in native petroglyphs for centuries. It was already a place of memory and meaning for the people who lived there. And what does Clark do? He takes out his knife and he carves his own name and the date right over it.
Over their history.
In many ways, the core of Discovery simply carved a new American name over an ancient, already thriving world. As you look at modern maps of the West today, covered in highways and cities and state lines, ask yourself, are we still just carving our names over someone else's story?
A profound question to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will see you on the next deep dive.